During the cold months of 1475, the forces of the Ottoman Empire advanced into a confined mountain pass, fully confident they would obliterate a minor state and secure an unobstructed route into the heart of Europe. However, what awaited their arrival wasn't panic or capitulation. Instead, they encountered a cohesive population, calm, quiet, and meticulously ready to execute a lethal trap. From elevated positions along the icy ridgelines, Stephen observed the approaching enemy with military forces numbering only half their strength. Every hillside, every water crossing point, every wisp of morning mist had been strategically manipulated for this precise encounter. As the Ottoman columns penetrated deep into the pass's center, the eerie quiet exploded into violence. Projectiles descended in torrents, artillery fire ripped through the haze, the frozen waterway fractured beneath retreating troops. When visibility finally returned, an imperial army lay devastated. A modest nation had successfully defended the entry point to Europe. The reverberations of that winter morning would resonate throughout the continent for generations to come. Throughout the 1400s, Europe existed as a landscape of constantly changing territorial boundaries and perpetual anxiety. Southward, the Ottoman Empire expanded at an alarming rate. Their military forces had seized Constantinople and were penetrating progressively deeper into the Balkan territories annually. To numerous Europeans, the Ottomans appeared invincible, an imperial power that consumed kingdoms as effortlessly as tempests consume shorelines. Positioned north of this expanding empire lay a considerably smaller territory, Moldavia. This was a predominantly rural principality characterized by woodlands, elevated terrain, and river systems. It possessed neither substantial wealth, heavily fortified positions, nor support from powerful alliances. What rendered Moldavia strategically significant was its geographical placement. It occupied the critical space between the Ottoman Empire, the Hungarian Kingdom, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Whichever authority controlled Moldavia would dominate the commercial pathways, river crossings, and roadways providing direct access into Central Europe. This geographical reality meant one undeniable fact: Moldavia possessed zero margin for strategic errors. The territory's ruler was Stephen, subsequently known to history as Stephen the Great. He had assumed control of a principality completely surrounded by more powerful, wealthier neighboring states. Moldavia could never compete regarding artillery capabilities, cavalry forces, or financial resources. Consequently, Stephen governed with extreme prudence. He negotiated diplomatically, paid required tribute when necessary, and carefully avoided antagonizing any of the regional powers encircling his lands. However, even extreme caution possessed inherent limitations. Continuous years of Ottoman territorial expansion subjected Moldavia to intensifying pressure. Financial tributes demanded by the empire steadily increased. Political requirements grew increasingly burdensome. Control over strategic ports, particularly Chilia and Catate Alba, became subjects of constant struggle. Stephen observed as other minor states attempted appeasing the Ottomans only to forfeit additional territory annually. He comprehended the pattern clearly. Once an imperial power begins constricting its control, it seldom relaxes that grip. Initially, Stephen attempted maintaining peaceful relations, but eventually the demands became excessive. The Ottomans progressively treated Moldavia less as an autonomous ally and increasingly as property, something to be incorporated into the empire at their convenience. Stephen recognized that continued compliance would result in Moldavia's gradual disappearance. Tensions escalated along the frontier regions. Armed clashes erupted between Moldavian patrol units and Ottoman military forces. Disagreements concerning strategic fortress control evolved into armed confrontations. Stephen resisted certain Ottoman policies, and Constantinople interpreted this not as diplomatic disagreement but as open defiance. By late 1474, the diplomatic relationship had completely collapsed.
Ottoman leadership determined that Moldavia had become a problematic situation, and problems required swift crushing before they inspired others toward resistance. Military commanders began mobilizing an army sufficiently large to overwhelm Stephen in a single decisive campaign. For Moldavia, this represented far more than a mere political conflict. It marked the commencement of a desperate struggle for national survival.
Stephen received intelligence warnings from his reconnaissance units. An Ottoman military force numbering tens of thousands was assembling to march northward. He could never match their numerical strength. He could never compete with their financial resources. But he absolutely could prepare strategically. The decisions he implemented during the weeks preceding the invasion would lead them all toward a frozen valley near a settlement called Vaslui, a location where history would shift in directions no empire anticipated. Winter descended upon Moldavia with brutal, merciless silence. Snow blanketed the hills, forests, and frozen pathways leading inward from southern approaches. Most military forces avoided campaigning during this harsh season, but Stephen of Moldavia possessed no such luxury. He understood the Ottomans were mobilizing their forces, and each passing winter day brought them incrementally closer. If Moldavia remained passive, it would be obliterated before spring's arrival. Stephen commenced preparations long before the first enemy soldier violated the border. His strategic approach depended not upon numerical superiority or financial resources, as he possessed neither, but rather upon transforming Moldavia itself into an obstacle. Villages situated near the southern frontier were discreetly evacuated to safer locations. Food reserves were relocated so advancing soldiers would discover nothing to sustain themselves. Woodland pathways were modified or obstructed. Water wells were concealed. Frozen river crossing points were mapped with meticulous detail, because an army unaware of where ice remained thin could suffer catastrophic losses before a single arrow was released. The civilian population neither complained nor panicked. Moldavians had coexisted with danger for multiple generations and trusted Stephen completely. They understood this represented the only method to make the terrain work for them rather than for invading forces. While villages prepared, Stephen restructured his military forces. He couldn't match the Ottomans soldier for soldier, so he concentrated on speed, maneuverability, and intimate terrain knowledge. Light cavalry units formed the foundation of his tactical approach, fast-moving riders capable of striking deeply, vanishing into wooded areas, and reappearing miles distant. Archers practiced firing from mounted positions and from concealed locations behind elevated ridges. His elite troops, the warriors he trusted most profoundly, remained in close proximity, prepared for deployment at the critical moment. Even the peasant militia forces, men possessing minimal armor but fierce devotion, received assignments matching their capabilities. They knew the forests more intimately than any outsider possibly could, and that knowledge alone rendered them valuable combatants. By the time preparations reached completion, Stephen had assembled approximately 20,000 men. This force was substantially smaller than the approaching Ottoman army would be, but far better adapted to Moldavia's winter environment. He made no promises of victory. Instead, he informed his people that their survival depended upon fighting as Moldavians, quick, flexible, and impossible to corner effectively. Stephen also contacted other Christian rulers hoping for military reinforcements. If Moldavia collapsed, the Ottomans would possess an unobstructed route toward Hungary and Poland. Yet when his diplomatic envoys returned, they carried only courteous words, not soldiers. Poland offered sympathetic expressions. Hungary offered good intentions. Neither dispatched troops. Stephen accepted this reality pragmatically. Awaiting assistance would merely squander time he didn't possess. As December progressed, Moldavian scouts reported genuine movement along the Danube regions. Ottoman supply lines were forming systematically. Military encampments were being established. The commander, Hatem Suleiman Pasha, was gathering tens of thousands of men for an invasion into Moldavia. Stephen's response wasn't to launch preemptive strikes or initiate border skirmishes.
Instead, he vanished from Ottoman observation. His encampments were concealed within forested areas. His cavalry avoided unnecessary engagements. He projected an impression of fear and withdrawal, ensuring the Ottomans would advance with overconfidence, believing Moldavia was already defeated. Behind that carefully crafted illusion, he prepared the killing ground. Stephen concentrated on a valley near the town of Vaslui, a location characterized by marshlands, fog, narrow slopes, and frozen river channels. He studied how fog accumulated at dawn, how sounds traveled across the valley, and where ground turned treacherous beneath the snow. This was terrain where a numerically superior army would struggle maintaining maneuverability. This was terrain where Moldavians could deliver devastating strikes from elevated, concealed positions and disappear before the enemy comprehended what had occurred. He ordered defensive trenches excavated beneath snow layers, rendering them invisible to advancing troops. Archers were positioned behind ridgelines, where the Ottomans wouldn't detect them until the initial arrow volleys descended. Small artillery pieces mounted on sleds were hidden within wooded areas, allowing quiet repositioning and firing without revealing their precise locations. To further enhance Ottoman overconfidence, Moldavian riders attacked supply convoys or scouting parties only briefly before withdrawing. These rapid strikes created the illusion of chaos, of a nation fragmenting, of an army too small and too terrified to stand and engage. None of this was coincidental. Every action formed part of a comprehensive plan.
Then arrived the intelligence Stephen had been anticipating. The Ottoman army had crossed into Moldavia. Tens of thousands of soldiers were marching northward, following the roads and valleys Stephen had already converted into a deadly trap. As they penetrated deeper into Moldavian territory, the winter fog intensified. The rivers froze unevenly, and the valley near Vaslui drew closer with every step. The Ottomans believed they were pursuing a desperate, fleeing enemy. They believed victory was inevitable. But Stephen understood differently. He knew the empire was marching directly toward the location he had selected, the place where numerical superiority would matter considerably less than meticulous preparation. The trap stood ready. All that remained was for the Ottomans to enter it. Before sunrise on January 10, 1475, the valley near Vaslui was engulfed in dense, frigid fog. It rolled across the terrain like smoke from an invisible conflagration, obscuring the ridgelines, concealing the riverbanks, and transforming the atmosphere into a cold, pale barrier. Stephen had been waiting for precisely this meteorological condition. He understood the Ottomans depended upon clear visibility and tight formation integrity. Fog would disrupt that, silently, completely. The initial indication of the Ottoman advance wasn't visual, but auditory, the muted, distant rumbling of boots, hooves, and transport wagons. Tens of thousands of men were forcing their passage through a narrow valley, completely unaware of how the terrain twisted beneath the snow cover. They believed the Moldavians were retreating further northward. They believed the valley was unoccupied. It absolutely wasn't. Stephen's forces were already positioned, distributed across the elevated ridges flanking both sides of the valley floor. They remained silent, motionless figures partially obscured behind trees, rock formations, and snow-covered earthworks. Archers maintained their bows at ready, awaiting the signal. Cavalry units crouched beside their horses in absolute stillness. No fires burned, no voices rose. It appeared as though the entire Moldavian army had become integrated with the frozen landscape. The Ottomans entered the valley in extended columns, oblivious that the fog was concealing thousands of eyes monitoring their every movement. As they advanced forward, something else began filling the air, the sound of Moldavian war horns. It commenced softly, one horn, then another, echoing from multiple directions. Within the fog, it sounded as though the valley itself possessed life. The Ottomans decelerated. Some shouted commands, others searched the mist for movement, but the fog revealed nothing. Then Stephen struck with devastating force. A sudden eruption of arrows burst from the heights, hundreds initially, then thousands.
The fog rendered it impossible for the Ottomans to identify where the projectiles originated, but the arrows cut through the white haze and struck their formations with brutal precision. Soldiers raised shields, stumbled, shouted, and attempted forming proper defensive lines, but they couldn't even determine which direction the assault originated from. Before they could reorganize, Moldavian artillery fired. Small, mobile guns concealed behind ridgelines. Their thunder reverberated throughout the valley, amplified by the fog.
Shot after shot pounded the Ottoman columns, shattering their formations and forcing them into confusion. As the Ottomans attempted reorganizing, Stephen delivered his next strike. Light cavalry units charged from the fog at unexpected angles, hitting the Ottoman flanks with speed and precision. They released arrows, slashed with sabers, then vanished back into the mist before the Ottomans could mount counterattacks. Some units struck from the left, others from the right, and sometimes from both simultaneously. The Empire's disciplined infantry suddenly found themselves battling shadows. Throughout the valley, panic proliferated. Officers shouted contradictory orders because nobody could observe the complete battlefield. Units advanced when they should have maintained position. Others retreated directly into their own comrades. The fog distorted sound, making it impossible to determine where commands originated. Stephen observed from a concealed ridge position. He waited patiently. He needed the Ottomans to be thoroughly disoriented before unleashing the decisive blow. When the moment arrived, he signaled his trumpeters. A deep, rolling blast filled the valley, a Moldavian charge call. From behind the fog, Moldavia's main forces surged forward, descending the ridges in a coordinated assault. This was the strike Stephen had been preserving. Infantry and elite guards sweeping downward like an avalanche, striking an enemy already blinded, scattered, and exhausted. The valley erupted into absolute chaos. Ottoman soldiers, still struggling for visibility, suddenly found Moldavian infantry crashing into them frontally while cavalry hammered them from the flanks. Shields splintered violently. Horses slipped on frozen mud. Drums and trumpets drowned beneath the sounds of men shouting, steel clashing, and the hissing of arrows raining from above. Some Ottoman units attempted retreating across the frozen river, but the ice had weakened under days of marching. Moldavian archers targeted the crossing points systematically. Arrow after arrow struck the ice, and men began plunging through into the freezing water. Those who reached the opposite bank discovered new enemies awaiting them. Moldavian riders had circled behind the valley and now blocked any possibility of retreat. The once massive Ottoman army found itself trapped, pressed between riverbanks, fog-covered slopes, and relentless attacks from all directions. Stephen rode into the battlefield only when the enemy was completely broken. His presence ignited a final surge of Moldavian courage. Soldiers pushed forward, pressing the Ottomans deeper into disarray. The Empire's battle standards dropped sequentially, disappearing into the snow. By midday, the fog began lifting. What it revealed was a valley devastated by one of the most crushing defeats the Ottoman Empire had ever experienced. Thousands of soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. Others fled into the woods only to be hunted down by Moldavian scouts familiar with every trail. For Stephen's forces, the victory was overwhelming. For the Ottomans, the loss was incomprehensible. And for Europe, the news that a small principality had routed an empire would echo far beyond that frozen valley. But for now, in the battle's aftermath, the only sound was wind moving across the snow, carrying with it the memory of a morning when Moldavia refused to surrender. When the final echoes of combat faded across the valley, the fog finally dissipated. What emerged beneath it didn't resemble the remnants of a clash between two forces. It resembled the aftermath of a catastrophe. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were scattered across the frozen terrain, some lying where arrows had struck them, others collapsed near the shattered ice where the river had consumed entire formations.
The once mighty columns that had marched confidently into Moldavia had vanished, replaced by scattered survivors struggling to comprehend how their overwhelming numbers had transformed into devastating defeat. Stephen did not celebrate, not yet. Victory on the battlefield was one matter. What followed was another entirely. He rode slowly through the valley, not as a conqueror admiring spoils, but as a commander ensuring the danger had truly passed. His horse moved carefully across the churned snow, while his officers reported which portions of the Ottoman force had been annihilated, which had fled, and which might still regroup somewhere in the southern forests. Moldavians pursued the retreating Ottoman soldiers for miles, but Stephen ordered his men against excessive pursuit. He understood the risks. A triumphant army could quickly become reckless, and he refused to lose men to carelessness. Instead, he dispatched small, rapid units, scouts who knew the terrain, to monitor escape routes. Their reports confirmed what he had hoped. The Ottoman army no longer functioned as an army. It was a mass of scattered groups, fleeing in different directions, leaderless and frozen. Many without weapons, some without boots, all desperate to reach safety. News spread rapidly throughout the countryside. Farmers who had hidden in the woods emerged. Villagers who had fled in terror returned to their homes, moving quietly among the trees as though uncertain whether to believe the reports. Then they observed Moldavian soldiers returning victorious, carrying captured banners and prisoners. Relief washed over them. Relief mixed with disbelief. Against all logic, against all predictions, against the terrifying reputation of the empire, Moldavia had prevailed. Stephen assembled his council that same evening. The Enermen were exhausted, many wounded, but their faces carried something more powerful than fatigue: pride. They had confronted an army that should have crushed them, yet they remained standing. But Stephen's thoughts already focused on what came next. He understood that defeating an Ottoman force once didn't guarantee security. The empire was vast, disciplined, and relentless. A single setback, regardless of how humiliating, wouldn't prevent them from attempting again. Stephen needed Europe to comprehend this reality. He needed allies to finally recognize that Moldavia wasn't merely a distant buffer zone, but a protective shield between them and the advancing empire. So he dispatched messengers riding through the night, carrying news of the victory to the courts of Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Their correspondence described what had transpired at Vaslui, not as boasting, but as a warning. If Moldavia had fallen, the Ottomans would already be positioned at Central Europe's gates. The victory hadn't merely saved one principality, it had bought time for everyone. Across Europe, reactions were immediate. Kings and nobles who had ignored Stephen's earlier appeals now praised him openly. Chronicles later recorded that the bells of Krakow rang for days. In Rome, the Pope declared Stephen a champion of Christendom. In Transylvania and Poland, travelers carried word of the battle, speaking of it with profound awe, as though recounting a miracle. But for now, in the battle's aftermath, the only sound was wind moving across the snow, carrying with it the memory of a morning when Moldavia refused to surrender.